What is difficult about giving $120 million over 8 years?
Funder know thyself. Because you have to know kind of what's your circle, and then where's the circle of potential nonprofits that you would be partnering with and becoming a funding partner with.
Hello and welcome to the Simple Charity Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Grosso. Today on the show, I interview Steve Stedham, the former executive director of a foundation that sunsetted. That means that they gave away all of the funds in the foundation, including the principal. Over a number of years, Steve led this process of giving away over $100 million, and I talked to him about what that experience was like and what wisdom he has for others with charitable assets who are considering a similar path. With over $1.5 trillion today in private foundations, and with the announcement this year that the Gates Foundation will sunset over the next 20 years, I'm very interested in this topic as a concept that can accelerate nonprofit work and advance God's kingdom throughout the world. Steve and I talk about grant making, the relationships between funders and nonprofits, and the love of God. Steve has a PhD in topics related to philanthropy, and it was an honor to have him on the show. Join me for a conversation where Steve shares his notes and reflections from his journey of giving away over $100 million. This is your podcast, you are listeners. So as always, please send me your thoughts, your questions, any suggestions you have on things we should talk about on the show or guests that would be good to have on the show. My email address is brian@simplecharity.org. That's Brian with an I. And if this show is helpful to you, please click a 5-star rating in your podcast app. This is super helpful for us to get the show out to more listeners. We're so glad that you're with us today.
Hi, my name is Melissa, and I serve as a Simple Charity philanthropic advisor to individuals, couples, families, foundations, and family offices in the Raleigh-Durham, Chapel Hill area of North Carolina, but also to clients around the country. If you're curious about your own generosity journey and would like help thinking through a philanthropic strategy with intentionality to discern where God is calling you to love people, to find excellent nonprofits to partner with, or to understand the impact of your current grant making, I would love to connect and share more about Simple Charity's philanthropic advising offerings. You can connect with me at melissahall@simplecharity.org. That's melissahall@simplecharity.org. And you can learn more about us at simplecharity.org. That's simplecharity.org.
Well, Steve Stedham, thank you for being here. Welcome to the Simple Charity Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I am really excited for this conversation, Steve, for a number of reasons. We're going to talk about your work at a mid-sized foundation, and you're an expert in philanthropy, and there's so much I can learn from you. You cocked your head when I said that, but I would consider you an expert in philanthropy. And but before we get into all of that, Steve, what are you grateful for today?
I am grateful for grandchildren. I just spent the morning with my 3 grandchildren. They just moved back here into the Kansas City area from Denver, and it's been a joy. So it's just been actually about a week that they've been here now. So we've been having a lot of fun with them. So definitely grateful for grandkids nearby.
Steve, how old are your grandkids?
4, 2, and 10 months.
Oh my gosh, Steve, that is the exact ages of my 3 children.
Is it really?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I have 3 boys, 4, 2,
wow.
and 9 months. But yeah. So I that it's fun age. Our 2-year-old is very chaotic. I don't know what the 2-year-old in your family is like, but ours is in a very chaotic season. Lots of pulling all the books off the bookshelf and
yeah, we had a lot of book reading this morning, and so my back hurts a little bit because you got to be on the floor when you read, and so then everybody's crawling all over you. But anyway, it was a lot of fun.
Yes. Well, that's awesome. Well, Steve, as I said, I consider you an expert in philanthropy, and but tell us a little bit of your story and kind of what your career journey has looked like, and how you have learned about philanthropy.
Yeah. So my career started, I was in sales and marketing, and I started with what is now Thomson Reuters, which was West Publishing Company way back in the day in Minneapolis. And so worked there for about 19 years. And that brought me to Kansas City. It brought the family here. And we were headed back up to the Twin Cities, back to the home office. We were just going to be down here 2 years, and that was, I think, 25 years ago. So we really love it here in Kansas City. And while we were here, I just felt that I was being led to move into something else. And at the time, it wasn't necessarily philanthropy that was laid out. It was just something different than the space that I was in. And so I was looking at some nonprofits, but then an opportunity came to be a part of a family foundation. And I was really intrigued with it. They were supporting some of the ministries and nonprofits that I thought were really doing some wonderful things. And so I joined. And so that was about 18 years of being a part of that. So felt like half of my journey, my professional life, is part of a for-profit that was a private, then became public. So I experienced that experience, kind of the quarterly, what have you done for me lately, kind of things. And then I also now experienced a lot of being a part of a foundation. And people would say, well, obviously one's easier than the other. And I said, yeah, but not the ones you think it is. They said, actually giving away money is really hard, and giving away someone else's money is even harder.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I think that has really been quite a learning journey for me. And so that's my journey. That ended. It was a sunset foundation. It was set up to spin down. And it wasn't a determined time. It was actually a determined amount that we would give away each year, and a determined way to invest. And so it was fairly conservative investing strategy that did us well in 07 and 08 and some others. But it was simply a matter of time before that was going to be spent down. So that happened about 2.5 years ago. And since then, I am now doing nonprofit management consulting, and both with foundations as well as nonprofits.
So what causes was the foundation interested in? And can you give us a sense too of how the foundation operated and is governed? And maybe for folks who are listening who aren't familiar with how family foundations work,
Sure.
What was the org chart? How are the decisions made, and how did all that work?
Yeah. So it is a family foundation. So we had family members, second generation family members were a part of the board. Our founder wanted the board to be have a majority of non-family members, which by design. So we always maintained that. And so that was the board itself. And then the staff, it was a smaller staff. We had 5 most of the time. And then as we spent down the final years, that just began to pare back. But that was really the structure. Most of us on staff were program officers. And so we would, carry out the due diligence, and we would do a fair amount of traveling. About 90% of what we granted to was outside the U.S.
Oh, really?
And so we did a fair amount of travel. And then, I think that would be kind of the rough sketch. We were focused on evangelism and discipleship, which would look more like church planting, pastoral training. It would look like those would be probably the bigger ones. There were also yeah, go ahead, Ron.
I was going to ask, so you say church planting, is that, I think of church planting as two main categories, buckets. There's the traditional church planting, usually with brick and mortar buildings, and then the church planting movement, disciple making movement, CPM, DMM, kind of these small, rapidly multiplying house churches. Which one of those categories were y'all supporting?
Yeah, so it was a little both, but
yeah, okay.
less on the bricks and mortar.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, whether it be India, Indonesia, some of those different places, Iran. So those tended to be more the non-brick and mortar, just because they were a little more closed in some of those areas. But then where there was more openness, we tended to be involved with those that were a little more brick and mortar, a little more above ground.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I want to do a podcast episode, maybe a couple episodes on disciple making movements. I think a lot of Christians don't know what those are or what's happening around the world, and there's a really remarkable story to tell around that. But that's not the podcast today. What I really want to talk about with you, Steve, is this idea of sunsetting a foundation. So sunsetting meaning giving away the principal, giving away all the assets until the foundation no longer exists. And what's interesting about this to me, there's a few things that are interesting. And I would love to just hear your story of what that experience was like. But what's interesting to me is there's a growing trend with family foundations towards sunsetting. So over the last 5 years, the percentage of family foundations that are in an active spend down rose from 9% to 13%, which is a meaningful change. And more than 28% of family foundations are currently considering sunsetting. So let's start with, let's start with I'm curious what you make of that trend. Is this a good trend or a bad trend?
I'm fascinated. It's like, when you start driving a certain car, you start thinking about maybe, I think I'm going to purchase this kind of car. All of a sudden, you see that kind of car everywhere.
Right.
And it's the same kind of thing. Once we got into our spin down mode or sunsetting mode, all of a sudden it was like we just started seeing more and more people would be asking us about it. So I am amazed that it's that high. But I would say, sunsetting isn't for everybody. And no doubt there would be groups that, shouldn't sunset. I hope they don't. Others, maybe it is the right thing for them. I never had the opportunity to talk to our founder. He passed away in 1997, and he made this charter, developed the charter for the trust. And the way the charter was designed, I mentioned it earlier, but the way it was designed, it had spin down, all over it. And talking to some of the family members, they said, he would be so surprised that it lasted as long as it did. It just wasn't in his mindset that it should go on. He wanted those particular these sets of funds. There were a couple large assets that were sold, and those made up most of the corpus, and that's what we gave the grants off of, and that's what we worked through. And so he didn't want any new funds coming in other than just proceeds from investments and things like that. But otherwise, that was really it was from the very beginning, that the design was in mind. The fascinating thing, though, is that early on, it didn't look like sunset was ever going to happen.
Interesting.
The market was doing so well and other things and the investments that it just didn't look like it was going to happen. But certainly, as the economy kind of comes and goes, there was then, a time when it began to eat away at that. So we, about I think it was around maybe 2014, we really stepped back and took a hard look at it, because at that point we decided we need to get really serious about this. We can't just kind of fizzle away. We needed intentionality with it. And so at that time we decided that we want to finish well. And so finishing well became really the mantra for our strategy. And what did that look like? And so at that time, we stepped back and really looked at ourselves. And I'm sure when you're talking to folks, it's the same kind of thing. Funder, know thyself. And I think that's where we needed to, even though we'd been in operation for many, many years, it was a time for us to say, okay, what does it look like now based on where we are and then where we want to get to? So what does that now look like for us to finish well? And so we looked across the number of groups that we were supporting currently and decided, okay, let's really settle on impact and sustainability being those two things that we would want for each one of the groups that we work with. And so we did, everybody loves the 2x2. And so we just set up the impact and sustainability as our X and Y axis and created quadrants. And within those quadrants, that's where we determined, kind of that high-low, when we wanted to ultimately graduate folks out into the high. And it was then our way of seeing that our work, our partnership with those folks, we've done what we can do for them. That was our way of contributing to the kingdom. And so that was the pathway. And then we tried to move people through those quadrants and graduate them out. So we had some that were already in what we'd call the accelerate quadrant. We needed to, graduate those folks. And that would be the other thing I would say, Brian, one of the biggest things in this whole process, both internally and externally, is communication.
Right.
You have to over communicate.
Communication to nonprofits.
Yeah, and to yourselves and to your board. So
right.
It takes a lot of communication as well, because staffing changes, and so it's important that not just be something you say once and then don't revisit, as well as when you're talking with board members. And so we began to change our board book based around our quadrants. And so when a board member would look at a particular set of projects, they would know that it's now in a particular quadrant. And then annually we would evaluate groups and decide who's moving to which quadrant, and we would communicate a lot of that to the board. And that really became, for us, our way of saying, how are we doing? Yeah. And so our way of communicating with the board really revolved around these 5 intended impacts that we were looking for as we moved and progressed people through.
Just to add a little bit of context to this, so that really intentional process and strategy for Sunset, you said started in 2014. What was the corpus at that point? I mean, what was the assets in the foundation at that point? Or ballpark?
Yeah, ballpark. Maybe like 120 million, something like that.
120 million. And then you sunsetted, I guess, 2 years ago, you said, so was that 2022? So you have 120 million, you gave $120 million from 2014 to 2022, plus the money that you made on the investments in that time. You mentioned philanthropy is hard work. What is hard? In specific detail, what is difficult about giving $120 million over 8 years?
Yeah, one is, I would say, finding those groups that you can partner with that share your DNA, that overlap with you. And that's why I said, at the beginning, funder, know thyself. Because you have to know kind of what's your circle. And then where's the circle of the particular potential nonprofits that you would be partnering with and becoming a funding partner with. If there's strong overlap, that's probably a group you would want to or can go deep with. But even deep is a relative term because it all depends on the size of the group. That
Right.
would be the other thing is, yeah, you could give away a lot in a big number just to a few, but there are quite a few groups that couldn't handle that. And
Right.
So we would always try to stay out of the top 5 funding groups, with particular groups. For some that works, others it doesn't necessarily, but that wasn't something that we chose to be, one of the biggest groups. I think that's a set of responsibility, and especially as we were winding down, that wasn't a good spot for us. That would be more for a longer term partner. And so we even began to shut down certain quadrants, systematically. And that was the time for us to move away from groups. We had an invest quadrant, and that's where we looked at smaller, newer groups that had a unique theory of change or a proven leader that was starting something new. But even those particular initiatives, we needed to begin to pare down from as time went on, just because we're not a good partner for those groups over time.
Yeah. So the communication. So you don't want, I'm trying to understand. So you don't want a nonprofit to be overly reliant on a funder who has an expiration date. So there's a sense of, did that make your foundation and your program officers lean into more conversations around capacity building, around development, some of these things that, frankly, some foundations shy away from having, but if you know that your life, your involvement's limited, you actually want that organization to be as healthy as possible when you're gone.
Yeah, totally. I think we would say that as we moved into our finish well phase, that we probably did some of our best granting during that time. And because I think we knew where we wanted to go, and I think we were a better partner at that time. For some groups, like you mentioned, some groups now, we felt like we could actually sit on the same side of the table with them. And it was fascinating as we did that, we began to have a different kind of relationship. So we weren't simply providing funds to allow them to expand, existing programs, or we weren't focused on the end programs, the programs that happen out for a group. As you noted, for some of them, especially in our growth and accelerate quadrants, we were looking much more deeply, and we were looking more longer term down the time horizon, which is really fascinating. It's kind of an oxymoron. As our time was ending, we were looking further down the time horizon with certain groups. And I think that offered a way for us to be probably more a better sounding board. We weren't offering, advice. We didn't have advice to give necessarily, but what we could do is be that, maybe they want to have a conversation that they probably couldn't have with their board, or they couldn't have with some of their staff. We talked about certain things, and what's interesting, those particular groups, the two biggest things that came up in most all those conversations was around governance and impact evaluation.
Yeah.
And those were things they just didn't talk about a lot with other groups.
Well, they don't feel safe. They don't feel safe to bring up those issues with other funders.
Yeah. So, when we've all asked the question, how do you know what you're doing is working?
Right.
That's a rough question.
Yeah.
You have to be courageous to want to dig into that.
If you're a nonprofit CEO, the answer to that question from a foundation is, oh, of course it's working, Steve.
That's right.
Let me tell you all the stories of people whose lives have been transformed.
Absolutely.
And I'm not trying to give nonprofit CEOs a hard time there, too. I mean, I think nonprofits can be making a positive impact and just doing a bad job of measuring that.
Sure.
Nonprofits can be making a positive impact and not be measuring it at all, frankly. And so you can somewhat decouple those things, but to get to that point of health and honesty and transparency. I mean, we live in a messy, broken world. And the issues that nonprofits are trying to address are very, very hard issues.
They're intractable for a reason, right?
They're intractable for a reason, yes. And so I think if nonprofits do have this relationship with funders, if funders can create a space of psychological safety, for nonprofit CEOs and executive directors to be able to honestly wrestle with the wicked problem they're working on, that will produce better impact to the long run. And it's interesting that actually a sunsetting foundation can be that safe haven.
Yeah, it's interesting. Internally, we would use kind of the shorthand way of talking about it. We would say either ministry first or project first. And so for groups in our growth and accelerate quadrants, we thought of them as ministry first. So yes, we continue to do project granting as a structure for how we granted, but those were focused around capacity building things. They were focused around, maybe it's some staff expansion, maybe it's some legacy software that needed to be upgraded, all of those kinds of things. And for many of them, it was trying to understand and better set up their impact evaluation framework, things like that, there aren't a lot of groups that want to just pay, just right out of the gate, just go right after that. So that's a hard one. And I would say the other thing, to riff a little bit on what you were talking about for the impact evaluation, it's a tough thing. So we were, evangelism discipleship. So how do you evaluate the change in someone's heart? Those kinds of things are really difficult to do, especially when you have more of a myopic view of what impact measurement is all about. So if you're thinking simply quantitatively, then yes, that's going to be very hard to evaluate, and it's going to be hard to then communicate that out. But if you can think both qualitatively and quantitatively, it begins to say, okay, what does that look like? And then what are we really after? What are those indicators that would suggest that what we're doing is having the kind of effect we want to have?
That's fantastic, Steve. I absolutely agree with you. I actually gave a talk. I'm smiling as you say that because I gave a talk last night to a group of professionals in Buckhead, near Atlanta, around wise giving. And my thesis of the talk was that philanthropic impact is stories of life change, which are communicated through both quantitative and qualitative information. And stories of life change, stories are really unwieldy, and you can't summarize them fully with a single number or even a set of numbers, no matter how robust your outcomes survey is. And those numbers don't capture, and nonprofit leaders sometimes complain about this, and I think they're right to complain. Those numbers do not capture the value and dignity of one human being made in the image of God, who is transformed for the better and is now reflecting the glory of God in the world. This is our theology around this, right? This person is now accurately, like the moon reflects the light of the sun, reflecting the glory of God in the world because they've been restored in some way by the ministry. And to just say that is a number and what's the monetary value of that number, I think nonprofit leaders are right to say we shouldn't talk that way.
Yeah, it's difficult too, because a nonprofit leader wants to tell those stories because they're a part of it. They can see that person's face. They can see the change that occurred in that person. And they're right to want to communicate that because a number doesn't. The problem is what a funder typically hears is an anecdotal story.
Right.
And they're left with the gap between those numbers and an anecdote. And so they're saying, so you expect me to make this leap that all those numbers you talked about were this. Whereas if you can do both qualitative and quantitatively, you can begin to talk through that gap and do it in a very scientific way. You can
Right.
do it in a way
Right.
that actually holds up.
Yeah, yeah. And there's even rigorous qualitative research tools and research methodologies. So let's circle back to, there was 28% of family foundations are considering sunsetting or spin down. What advice or counsel would you give to someone listening to this who has a family foundation and is considering a spin down and creating a plan to do that now, or is considering maybe including a sunset clause in their foundation? And like the person who set up the foundation you worked for, that spin down ended up happening, 25 or so years after his death. But that, yeah. So what advice would you give for anyone who's considering, is a decision maker in a family foundation, is considering setting this up?
Yeah, it's hard. I hate giving advice because it would presume you actually have some knowledge from or wisdom from which you can give advice. But since this, my one example of this that I kind of lived through, it was already all set up. But in looking around, as I've now talked to a lot of different groups who have gone through it, I would say, a lot of it does depend on family. And you can look at your, family and kind of determine, is this, a similar pathway that you think they're going to follow in? And is donor intent going to be maintained as you would hope or as you would imagine? And so I think the other piece of it is, how and when do you think these funds, getting into the kingdom would be utilized the best or the way you're imagining it? So for some, it's, you kind of hold on to it a little longer and let it, move through at a good pace. And, others, it's, maybe they do have that sense is for such a time as this, and they just have that sense that, it should. And so I think there's probably, some kingdom realities in there that I probably am not one to speak to on what that all looks like. But I would just say too, if you imagine that it would focus your intent in a way that maybe you don't see it happening another way, I would be an advocate for that. I mean, I would say it gave us a focus that we probably were lacking at that point in time. And to really focus on that, it gave us some really good grounding and some good structure. And so I would just, again, that might not be for maybe 1% of the folks, but I would say that would be another idea.
And for those who are part of this 13% who are currently doing this work, what advice do you have for someone who's giving all the assets away?
Yeah, there's a great resource I continually bring up with folks. It comes out of the Center for Effective Philanthropy, and it's a resource that's probably now, probably 10 years old or so, and it's called A Date Certain Limited Life Foundations. And they did basically a case study of 6 or 7 different foundations and kind of went through and found the commonalities. And it was fascinating because we were going through it at that same time, and we found the same things. It was really around collaboration, which is, again, we haven't talked about that, but that was one thing that came out for us, that we became like really focused on collaboration with other funders, especially.
Wow.
Both here and abroad. So that was really significant. I would say the communication, again, we just needed to get really good at how we communicate, what we don't communicate. We found early on we were communicating the wrong things, and we needed to communicate better about who we were and where we were headed.
I'm curious about what you mean by that. What do you mean by you're communicating the wrong things?
So the strategy that I was referring to, there were some pieces of that in terms of, where exactly we were placing a particular group in a particular quadrant. We were kind of just giving them everything about that. And it was more than what they needed, and it wasn't helpful to them. What they needed to know was that how we were thinking about our partnership with them more generally, and then how that was going to change or not change, how we were currently working with them and what that time horizon was. So that would be kind of the big thing. And I would say the last thing that we probably didn't do as well as we could have, but we did put an effort there, is celebration. I think sometimes you think, oh, okay, so you just end. That doesn't sound like it's really, a great thing. But we really decided that we were going to do a little case study of our own. And so we went back and looked at several different expressions of our giving in our different partnerships. And then we did a short little video film on those and kind of tied it back to the themes of what the trust was, how it began and what it was, why it began. So it was our way of celebrating that, and it was our way of looking at God's faithfulness. And I think at the end of the day, that's really what the family and the trustees felt like, that this is what we want to celebrate. We don't want to celebrate necessarily how great the trust was, but it really was how great God was through all of this.
That's beautiful, Steve. I'm curious if you have a sense of the impact, and I know we were just talking about quantitative and qualitative information both being relevant for philanthropic impact, but you gave away a lot of money or helped to do that. And so what difference did it make? Do you have a sense of how you would summarize what happened because of that? And do you know how many people came to know Jesus?
I think at one point, many, many years ago, people were probably focused a little more on that. Even folks, even in our trust, were a little more focused on that. But when I mentioned, back in 2014, we began to do a little different trajectory shift.
Right.
And the number one intended impact, as I mentioned, we had 5, but our number one intended impact was creating a denser network of complementary ministries focused on working through the church. And so that denser network requires especially ministry leaders connecting with one another and getting to know one another. And I would say some of the greatest impact, or at least the things that gave us most joy, and what we heard from leaders throughout the years, was a lot of times a foundation, just kind of like the sons of Issachar, you're sitting along that trade route, and you have the opportunity to connect leader to leader. And so we tried to do that as much as we could. And we just felt like when we were done, that in many areas of the world, there was a denser network that we were a part of. It wasn't us alone by any means. It was so many other people. But just being intentional around trying to connect leaders to leaders, no Lone Rangers, that seems to be some of the greatest impact that we've seen.
You invested in health, the health of these institutions, the charities themselves, the health of communities. I think even that's remarkable. And, and in our organization, we think about kind of 3 axes of our organization that all matter. And those are health, growth, and quality. And how do we get to the outer edges of all 3 of those axes at the same time? We need to grow. We want to stay healthy, personally, individually, relationally, socially, and then we want to offer really quality product. And I think it's for the church to invest in health, I think is actually a beautiful thing. And maybe sometimes we're over-indexed on growth and over-indexed on that tip of the spear, the conversions and versus, hey, is what we're doing really healthy here? So I'm just going to venture out and say that even as you're doing that, lots and lots of people came to know Jesus because those ministry leaders were connected, because they're collaborating better. That health leads to growth. Health actually leads to quality. In some sense, health gives the least visible fruit, and it is the most foundational for the tree, right? So
sustainable growth.
And sustainable growth. Yep. And so, but I think to have the humility to say we're going to invest in health of these organizations, not just the short-term wins and of these communities, and then we actually won't know. We won't be able to tell you, hey, this is the number of people who came to know Jesus. We won't know that until heaven, and maybe God will give us some counterfactuals. I don't know how this works. But certainly there was tremendous fruit, and that happened all around the world. And I think that's a beautiful thing to just even consider with our imagination. And I think it's an important thing, honestly, for funders to use their imagination when we don't get to hear every life story of the people who are impacted. And that doesn't mean that those people don't exist right now and have families and their lives are transformed by the gospel. Well, Steve, thank you so much for this conversation. And I just feel like there's so much I could learn from you. And I have lots of questions, but we've already talked for a while. So for the sake of our listeners, would love to just end this by talking about love. And our slogan at Simple Charity is to love generously. And this podcast is about helping all of us grow in loving generously like Jesus. So first of all, just circling back to philanthropy and sunsetting, how do you do the work of philanthropy with love?
Yeah, we were talking a little bit about evaluation, and I think the love is commitment, and I see that coming through. Our church is going through the book of Mark right now, and I just see that with Jesus, with his disciples. He was just committed to them. They were like I would have been, really thick-headed. I mean, you're seeing things and you're not seeing it. You don't quite have the eyes that you need to see it. And so he was so committed to them. And I think, how is it that we can be committed? It doesn't mean you have to, if you're giving to a group, it doesn't mean you have to give to that group for 50 years. But it does mean you should be committed to them as individuals, as an organization, not simply for their output and not simply for what they can do. So I would say it's really about a level of commitment and a commitment to others. I think we need to be doing more giving together. And so how is it that we can be committed one to another?
The invitation to grow this week is to send an email to a nonprofit that you support to encourage them and to check in on their work. Thank you to Michael Hansett for editing this episode, Grace Sukach for the podcast artwork, and of course to Steve Stedham for sharing your wisdom and insights with us. If you have feedback on this episode, you can reach me at brian@simplecharity.org. Next time, I share an interview with the executive director of a global nonprofit that emphasizes building strong relationships with local leaders and supporting them as they transform their communities. I hope you join me as we continue to learn to love generously like Jesus. Have a great week. See you next time.